Okay, everybody, we're going to try something a little new while I'm still kind of in the hospital, and that is to go through these PowerPoints with some narration to kind of give you a sense of what I would like you to get out of this material, and we'll see how this goes until I can get back in person. Today we're going to be talking about first language learning. And I want to start off by just going through the four major areas of language learning, the kinds of things that we have to learn in order to make use of language, and get a sense of what's involved and how the notion of a critical or a sensitive period might vary depending on what type of language learning that we're talking about. One of the first things that we have to do when we're confronted with the task of learning language is to figure out what kinds of sounds are present in the language. And there are some sounds that are present regardless of whatever language it is that we're speaking. There is no language, for example, that does not contain the sound ah, as in father. Every language has that sound. But there's a great deal of variability in the kinds of sound structures that we see across language. So, for example, we have some sounds in English, like the distinctions between R's and L's, that really don't necessarily occur in every language. In particular, Asian languages like Chinese, Japanese, don't have these sort of liquid sounds that we have, the RL distinction. There are also plenty of languages that have distinctions that we don't make use of. Zulu is a language that has a series of clicks, clicky sounds that are meaningful within the context of words and not language, but for us, that sounds like a non-linguistic sound that you're making. So one of the first things that we have to do as language learners is to figure out what kind of sounds are present in our language and what kinds of sounds are not. And we really start to seem to make that distinction for the most part in early language learning by about the age of 6 months. And one thing that we might want to investigate in terms of a critical period is that if we don't get experience in language, does it become more difficult over time to distinguish between what sounds are supposed to be in our language and what sounds aren't. So phonology, figuring out what the sound system of language is. A second area of language learning that we have to figure out is morphology. And morphology has to do with the structure of words and the way that we can subtly change the meaning of words by altering their form. In English, morphology typically consists of small changes that affect the meaning of nouns such as singularity or plurality. If we can talk about a cat. If we're talking about multiple cats, then we have to add an S. In verb morphology, we can effect some changes in the way that we structure the word that give us a sense of a tense. We can jump. If we're describing an ongoing action, we can talk about jumping. If we want to talk about action that is completed in the past, then we would add an ED. A lot of other languages are much more interesting in morphology than English. If you speak a language like Spanish, you have a lot more tenses to deal with. Some languages even use morphology for pretty interesting things that have to do with grammatical issues or meaning issues in language far beyond just simply tense. So one of my favorite examples is the African language Bantu, B-A-N-T-U. And Bantu uses morphology to express something about the meaning of the word. And there's this great example in Bantu of this marker that you could put on the end of words that tells you whether you're dealing with something that falls in the category of women, fire, and dangerous things. And so everything in Bantu that they think has to do with women, fire, and dangerous things has this little marker that they put on the word. English, again, is pretty boring. We just add S's and EDs and INGs, and that's pretty much it. But again, morphology, even though it may be used differently in other languages, we have to sort of figure out the system. How do we build words? How do we add these small units to words that subtly change their meaning? There are other languages like Navajo, Native American language Navajo, which does something pretty interesting with regard to the physical structure of objects and how that's expressed in morphology. So in Navajo, there's a marker that you can put onto the ends of words that gives you some kind of sense about how solid or flexible the object is. So in Navajo, you could talk about a stick, and you could add these little particles onto the word that will tell you whether it's a thick stick that's not bendable or a bendy stick. Other languages, it can tell you something about the knowledge state of the listener. In some languages, I can look at the morphology, and there's a marker that's going to tell me when I hear something like, it's raining outside, there's a marker on the verb that will tell me whether that's something that I've experienced myself, like I've seen it, I know it's raining, or whether someone just told me that it's raining. So again, morphology can be really useful in a lot of different ways, and one of the things that we have to deal with as language learners is to figure out in what way morphology is being used in our language. Alright, so phonology, sound system of language, morphology, the word building properties of language and how we use that word building system. Semantics is pretty straightforward, our third area of language learning, and that's just simply learning the meaning of words. We hear a word, we learn that it refers to an object or an action or some attribute of the object, and so we can look to see how well we can associate these words that we hear with particular kinds of concepts. So red, what is red? Is it a thing? Is it an action? Is it an attribute of an object? Right, so this is basically vocabulary learning for semantics. And then finally, syntax is what we think of as the grammar of language, the way in which we structure words together. And there's a rule-governed way that we do this. So when we combine words together, we don't combine words in a random way. We follow a particular order. Word order is something that's very important in a language like English, where we don't have very complicated morphology that tells us what the subject is, what the object is, what the verb is. So we depend on word order in English to give us that cue. The dog bit the man doesn't mean the same thing as the man bit the dog. And so what we have to figure out in our language with syntax is what kinds of rules govern the way that we string words together. Right, so what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about the research on these four different areas to get a sense of, do we have evidence that there is an equal likelihood of having a critical or a sensitive period in learning for phonology, understanding the sound system of language, for morphology, understanding how we use this word building kind of structure in our language. Is there a sensitive period for semantics? Is there a sensitive period for syntax? All right, so we've talked a little bit about what we have to learn in each of these areas. What's really the evidence of how this might apply to the idea of a sensitive period? Well, the first thing we could do, of course, is think about the case that we've talked about, Jeannie. What was Jeannie's phonology like? Was it normal? Did she sound normal? No, she sounded very very bird-like, kind of tweaky. It didn't sound like the kinds of utterances that we would expect an English speaker to make. So does that suggest that perhaps there's a sensitive period for phonology looking at Jeannie's case? I think we could make that argument for sure. Morphology, combining words together, I gave you some examples of what Jeannie's productions were. That was not really normal morphology either. Semantics, could she learn words? Well, if you remember, her vocabulary actually wasn't that bad. So of the three things that we've talked about so far, we could say that semantics was really her strongest suit. And if you think about the kinds of struggles that people have with language learning, it's usually not word learning that gives people the most problem. Usually it is the sounds or figuring out how verb inflections work. So maybe semantics is not subject to a sensitive period in the same way as phonology or morphology. What about syntax? Grammar. Was Jeannie's grammar good? Did she string words together in ways that made sense? No. So kind of looking at just what we've seen so far in terms of the case study of Jeannie, we would really probably conclude, I think, that phonology, sensitive period, yes. Morphology, sensitive period, yes. Syntax, sensitive period, yes. But semantics, maybe not. Because remember, Jeannie was actually pretty good at that. Now, of course, there are confounding variables for Jeannie. Her phonology, not that great. Morphology, not that great. Semantics, okay. Syntax, not that great. But what are the confounding variables? What do we need to worry about with Jeannie? Well, first of all, of course, she's not only is she deprived of language, but she's in an abusive kind of situation. And then, of course, what would Jeannie's long-term prognosis what would it have been like had she not been isolated? Was Jeannie mentally retarded? Did she have a developmental disability from birth like our father thought? We just don't have really good evidence on that. That's a really hard question to answer. What if Jeannie had been treated in a normal social way without that abusive component? Would she have turned out differently? Right, and so that begs the question of what kind of cases would be helpful to us. I mean, Jeannie was deprived of language, but she was deprived of a lot of other things too. She was deprived of loving parents. She was deprived of interaction with normal human beings. So, what do you think it would be like to look at a case of someone who was perhaps deprived of language, but who was raised in a loving kind of environment, where we might be able to disentangle a little bit the idea of the language loss versus the general social loss. And we do have some cases like that we can look at. And I'll give you a little bit of an example here. So what we're looking at is a situation where someone has been deprived of first language experience. So they're experiencing the deprivation of a first language, but they don't have the same kind of confounds as Jeannie did in terms of an abusive kind of component. Chelsea was someone who had been misdiagnosed as having been mentally retarded in early childhood, but in fact Chelsea's issue was that she had profound hearing loss. And she wasn't really correctly diagnosed until adulthood at about the age of 31, when she was fitted with hearing aids and was able to hear and process language for the first time. And her outcome was we could compare with Jeannie. So Chelsea, like Jeannie, learned a large vocabulary, but her syntax and morphology were actually worse than what Jeannie's were. So there's just some sample speech from Chelsea, recorded from some research done by Susan Curtis, who was one of the speech therapists who worked on the original Jeannie case. And these are some things that she recorded that Chelsea said. The small A the hat. Orange Tim car in. I want to be drive come. Breakfast eating girl. They are is car in the Tim. And on most of these you could kind of get a pretty clear sense of what she's trying to say. She has the words, she has the vocabulary, but she's just not pulling it together very well. So what we're kind of seeing here is evidence that, very much like Jeannie, having that language deprivation is really interfering seriously with the syntax, with the morphology. But the semantics of the word learning maybe not so much. Another interesting example is Jim. And Jim was a hearing child who was born of deaf parents. And so Jim is getting normal, loving interaction from his parents, but they're deaf and they cannot provide him with vocal language even though he himself is hearing. And Jim lived in an isolated rural area, and he wasn't really brought into speech contact with other hearing children until he was about 3.5 years old, 3 years, 6 months. And once he was introduced into that normal kind of hearing cohort, he seemed to have rapidly caught up in his spoken language development. And by the time he was 6 years old, you couldn't really tell the difference between Jim and a child who had been brought up around hearing parents. So you can kind of compare the case of Jim with the case of Chelsea. What's the big difference? Well, Jim, of course, is brought into speech contact much, much earlier than Chelsea is. So, looking, at the idea of a sensitive period, maybe even if there's some initial delay, if the child is brought into speech contact soon enough, there may not be long-term deleterious effects. Of course, these are case studies, and it's difficult to look at all the variables that might be going on with them to say, okay, this is really good, strong, clear evidence of age of learning effects, when there could be something special about these cases. But it's certainly very very thought-provoking, and leading us a little bit along the idea of how we already know sensitive periods work, and what we already saw with some of the brain-based evidence, where we were seeing these kinds of changes within the first years of life, but maybe not from the very beginning. Maybe it's possible you can have a slight delay in what might be typical language acquisition and still be able to kind of catch up, as Jim was able to do. Now, it's nice when we can get studies that look at groups of people, so we're relying less on case study evidence. And we have some good studies. Some of the best work comes from Alyssa Newport, who actually was the advisor of my advisor in graduate school. So she's kind of my intellectual grandmother when it comes to this language research, and your intellectual great-grandmother. And Newport in the 1990s did a series of studies looking at children who learned American, or people who had started, they were adults, people who had started learning American Sign Language at different ages during childhood. And what Newport discovered, so what she's doing is she's looking at these adults who had started learning sign language at different periods, and is looking retrospectively back at the age at which they started learning to kind of figure out at what point they were able to or how well they were able to learn based on when their initial exposure in the language was. Right? So to kind of summarize that research, what Newport found was that children who were exposed to American Sign Language before age 6 yielded native competence. Okay, so basically exposure before age 6, you're going to be at the top of the learning ability. Exposure after 7 yields more errors, and exposure after 12 a much higher rate and a much more variable error type of rate. So based on this research, what we're seeing is that as long as you're learning a language before 6, you should be pretty good. You should approximate native-like competence. So again, kind of conclusion from what we could talk about in first language learning is it looks like there definitely are age of learning effects that we can talk about. I'm going to set something up on Blackboard for us to continue the discussion. And if you have any questions, I hope you can go there and we'll continue to discuss and get them answered. All right, thank you very much. This is our first attempt at a recorded class in PowerPoint in this way, and we'll kind of see how it goes, and hopefully I'll be back in person and see you guys soon. Thank you.